For the first 2 years, Barbara accompanied Madison to and from school. But when Madison turned 8, Edward recommended to Barbara to let Madison go to school on her own because it was just close to their house. Barbara was a stay-at-home mom who didn't mind driving Madison to school. Every day, besides, she was concerned that Madison was still too young to be left alone. But when Edward insisted, she relented. She gave Madison a mobile phone and put a tiny journal in her backpack with their home address and vital contacts. So Madison could contact them if necessary, and that actually helped if Madison ever went to a friend's house after school or was late because she went to the park near her. School, she'd always call Barbara and let her know, that gave Barbara an assurance that her daughter was safe. One day, Barbara was bored at home and decided to surprise Madison by picking her up from school. She had also planned to take her to her favorite ice cream parlor nearby after Barbara got to Madison's school just in time, and as the dismissal bell rang, a stream of students spilled out of the front gate. Barbara spotted Madison's friends, Alice and Catherine, but Madison was nowhere to be seen. She thought Madison probably got held up with something and chose to wait. However, when Madison didn't come out after a few minutes, Barbara decided to look for her inside. She went to her classroom to see if she was there. She noticed the classroom was empty, except for Madison's teacher, Mrs. Blake, who was sitting at her desk looking over some papers. Barbara approached her worried. "Did you see Madison?" "I was waiting for her at the gate, but she never came out." "Oh, Mrs. Hunter, I'm sorry, it entirely slipped my mind to call you. Madison hasn't been to school in over a week. I was concerned that she was ill. She didn't show up today, and do you see these papers I'm carrying? We had a test, and she missed it." What a shock ran through Barbara upon hearing her 8-year-old daughter hadn't been attending classes. She asked, "What do you mean she leaves for school every morning?" "Mrs. Blake, that's strange considering she hasn't been attending her classes. Mrs. Hunter, is everything okay at home?" Barbara was at a loss for words. She dashed out of school and dialed Madison's number. The girl didn't answer. She called her multiple times with no success, and Madison's phone was turned off at one point. Barbara was sinking on the inside, wondering where her daughter was. She looked for Madison wherever she could, in parks and restaurants near the school, and contacted every friend she knew, but no one knew anything. Barbara was crying by this time, and she finally called Edward and told him everything. He asked Barbara to wait near the school and was there in a few minutes. They searched all of the places between their house and the school, including parks, cafes, restaurants, and their neighbors' houses. But Madison was nowhere to be found by the time Edward and Barbara were on their way home. It was already 8 p.m. They didn't notice when the day turned to night as they searched for Madison. Barbara was crying on the way back from school, and they had resolved to contact the cops as soon as they arrived home, but they were still 2 houses away. When Barbara saw Madison from afar waving with a boy, she started crying and screaming. "There she is, right there outside our house." When Edward narrowed his eyes, he realized Barbara was right. Jesus, thank God. As soon as they parked the car and got down, they ran to her. Suddenly, they glanced at each other, perplexed, when they discovered Madison wasn't alone, but was holding a baby wrapped in a white towel. "Who's that baby?" Madison asked. "And who is the little boy who just left?" Barbara inquired, perplexed. Madison lowered her head and said, "Sorry, Mommy." Barbara sternly proposed, "Can we please go inside and talk to Madison?" Once they got to the house, Barbara explained to her daughter how worried her daddy and she continued. "We were going to call the police, and that's when Madison shook her head. "No, Mommy, please, they're going to take Layla away. Please do not call the cops. I must keep Layla safe." Edward stepped in and calmed his daughter. "So Madison is the baby's name, Layla?" he asked. "Where did you find her, honey?" Madison started explaining and told them that Layla is her friend Terrence's sister. His granny is sick and cannot take care of Layla, and she refuses to go to the hospital because she says the cops will take Layla away. Layla's parents died 2 months ago. Edward and Barbara exchanged a worried look, and they realized that Terrence's grandma was worried that social services would take Layla away since she couldn't care for her, and then couldn't but ask, "Why didn't you go to class, honey?" "Mommy called you today, but your phone was turned off." The daughter replied, I'm sorry. I go to Terrence's house every day to look after Layla, so I don't have time to go to classes. I return home, and when he gets home from school, we were playing with Layla today, and I didn't check my phone when I finally decided to call Mommy. The phone was dead. Terrence's granny was very sick today, so Terrence and I spent the entire day caring for her. That's why I was late. I'm sorry. I didn't tell you anything because I was scared I wouldn't be able to play with Layla again. Barbara and Edward understood that it wasn't really Madison's fault. She was just trying to help a friend, so they didn't scold her but explained that it was wrong to skip classes. Can we keep Layla with us? Terrence cannot take care of her alone, and his granny is sick, the daughter said. Barbara immediately told her, "We can't keep someone else's baby like that with us. But Daddy and I will figure out a way to help her. Let's go inside now, it's getting cold." The following day, Barbara and Edward went to Terrence's house and told his grandma, Mrs. Peterson, everything he also offered to assist her in raising Layla, so she would not have to turn to the authorities and risk losing custody of Layla. The older woman was in tears and couldn't stop thanking Edward and Barbara. As time went on, Barbara started spending more time at Terrence's house and looking after Layla and Mrs. Peterson. She fell in love with Layla, and one day she asked Edward if they could adopt her and Terrence. Edward was more than happy to have Layla and Terrence as his children. So Barbara asked Mrs. Peterson first after much hesitation, and she was surprised when Mrs. Peterson agreed. "You see, honey," she said, "I'm an old bird, and I'm always worried about what will happen to my grandchildren after I die out." Barbara promised to take care of the children as they are her own. She made sure to persuade the granny to be relieved and to trust them. Then she added, "We were also wondering if you wanted to move in with us. The kids you see would love to have their grandmother by their side. So what do you think?" The granny smiled and told her how good of a person she is, and that she was sure that God sent them to help her. "Oh my goodness, thank you so much," she added. From that day on, Mrs. Peterson, Terrence and Layla moved in with the Hutts, and Edward and Barbara started. The adoption process was soon, and 2 months later, Terrence and Layla were legally theirs. If you were in the parents' shoes, what would you have done in a similar situation?